What does a man who is always on time for work, always smiling in the office, and always present at Sunday church look like at 2:30 a.m. in a quiet kitchen? I remember standing in the dim glow of the refrigerator light, the only thing on the counter a half-filled mug of coffee and a phone that had just gone to voicemail. Dad's voice was on the line, but his tone was clipped and urgent. "I'm in a meeting," he said, and then hung up. The clock read 2:30 a.m. I was alone in the house that had always felt safe. I had never questioned how he could be in a meeting so late. It was a routine. But that night something was off. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic. I walked past the living room, where the family photos were framed neatly on the wall, and paused at the kitchen door. Dad's car was in the driveway, its engine still running. He had always said he was working late, but the timing was never that late. I heard a faint click from the back door, as if something was closing. The phone buzzed again, this time with a different number. I didn't answer. The silence felt heavier than the quiet of a Sunday morning. I checked the kitchen clock, the one that had been there since I was a child. It blinked 2:30 a.m. I turned on the kitchen light, the bulb flickering slightly. The house was still. I pulled the curtains aside and looked out at the street, expecting to see the usual streetlights. Instead, the street was empty. The neighbor's porch light was on, but the house next door was dark. The usual hum of the city was replaced by an eerie calm. I remembered the stories I had heard about Dad. The community leader, the dependable father, the man who always put his family first. I had never imagined that the same man could be in a meeting at 2:30 a.m., with his phone in his hand, and that his presence in the house was a pretense. The pattern of his late nights had been a minor detail, but that night, the detail became a question I could no longer ignore. That was the first time I realized that the public image of my father didn't match the private reality. The realization that something was wrong settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. The house, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a stage where a hidden truth was unfolding. The night he left his phone on the counter, the silence felt different. I didn't think much of it at first, but the pattern of his late nights had always been a minor detail. That night, it became a question I could no longer ignore. If you've ever noticed behavior in someone close to you that didn't quite add up, you'll understand why this matters. The facts that follow are not speculation. They are the dates, the messages, the calls that were made and then erased. The more you watch, the clearer it becomes that the public image of a man who always smiled at the family is at odds with the private reality that was unfolding under the same roof. The house, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a stage where a hidden truth was being rehearsed. The next morning, I found a stack of receipts in the kitchen drawer. Foreign currency, dates that matched the nights he was supposedly working late. I also found a series of text messages that had been deleted, but the phone's backup still held a copy. The content was terse, filled with coded language that I didn't understand, but the frequency and timing were unmistakable. Each message was sent at the same hour, the same place. The living room where he was supposed to be with the family. I went to the garage and noticed a small, unmarked box tucked behind a stack of old tools. Inside was a camera, a recorder, and a stack of photographs that showed the family in moments I had never seen before. Smiling faces, but with a shadowed gaze. The pictures were dated from years ago, yet the faces looked too recent, as if the photographer had captured them in a different timeline. The more I dug, the more unsettling the details became. I started to wonder if the family's daily routines were a facade, a carefully choreographed act that hid a darker, more complex reality. The evidence was mounting, and each new discovery made the story feel less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate concealment. If you've ever noticed warning signs or hidden behaviors in someone close to you, you might find the following facts unsettling. The case unfolds in a way that forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the person you love may be living a double life. Stay until the end, because the next chapters reveal patterns that are not only disturbing but also deeply human. Only those who have seen similar red flags are invited to share their experience in the comments. Recognizing the signs can be the hardest part, but it is also the first step toward understanding what lies beneath the surface. He was the town's linchpin in the local manufacturing plant, a senior technician who had been promoted after a decade of steady, if unremarkable, service. When the plant's annual safety audit came up, he was the one who stepped in to coordinate the training sessions, and the paperwork he filed was always neat, no errors, no excuses. At the community center, he volunteered on the board that organized the annual Harvest Festival, ensuring the booths were set up on schedule and that the volunteer schedule ran smoothly. On the street, people would call him Mr. Reliable, or the guy who never misses a meeting. A neighbor once told a friend, "He's the one who keeps the neighborhood clock on time. You can count on him." A coworker, after a particularly hectic shift, remarked, "He handled the crisis like a pro. No drama, just solutions." Those snippets of dialogue, repeated over coffee cups and in passing conversations, built a portrait of a man who was dependable, methodical, and unflappable in the public eye. In the local church's Sunday school, he was the volunteer who organized the choir's logistics, making sure the sound equipment was set up before the choir rehearsals and that the seating arrangements were optimal for the audience. When the town's youth soccer team needed a new field, he was the one who coordinated the grant application, submitted the paperwork, and followed up on the funding decisions. His reputation among the neighbors was that of a quiet pillar, someone who could be counted on to fix a leaking pipe or to lend a set of tools without hesitation. A neighbor's remark, "He's the kind of guy who shows up with a toolbox and a smile," circulated through the neighborhood like a well-trod path. The local barista would occasionally note, "He's always there for the morning shift, never asks for a raise, just does his job." These observations, gathered from casual encounters, reinforced the image of a man who was consistently present, consistently dependable, and consistently uncontroversial. His public persona was further cemented by the fact that he never seemed to have any personal drama to share. When the town's annual Community Appreciation Night was announced, he accepted the invitation without comment, arriving in a plain suit, a pocket square, and a polite nod. He would sit in the back of the room, listening to speeches about civic pride, and never asked for a microphone. His co-workers would later describe him as the steady hand behind the operations, a phrase that echoed in the corridors of the plant and the halls of the town hall. Yet, the quiet reliability that defined him outside the house was not mirrored in the domestic sphere. Inside the home, the same calm surface would sometimes crack. He would leave the kitchen door ajar after a long day, the faint scent of coffee lingering, and would check the children's homework with a quick, almost impatient glance. When the family gathered for dinner, he would sit at the table, the silence punctuated by the clink of cutlery, and would respond to questions with curt, "I'll get back to you on that." The mother, who had once described him as the rock of the family, would later notice a subtle shift in his tone when she mentioned a disagreement with a neighbor. He would pause, then offer a brief, "We'll see." These small, almost imperceptible changes in demeanor, the way he'd roll his eyes at a mispronounced word or sigh when the television was too loud, were the first threads that began to unravel the facade that the world had come to accept. Every day, the house settled into a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. At 6:15 a.m., the front door would open with a soft click, and he would step out in his worn blue hoodie, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, the same faded logo still visible. He would pause for exactly 1 minute, looking straight down at the driveway before walking toward the car, which was always parked at the far right corner of the lot, its door ajar. The car's interior was consistently neat, no coffee cups or crumbs on the seat, a single gray blanket draped over the back seat. He would take a breath, then, without a word, slide into the driver's seat, adjust the rearview mirror, and start the engine with a steady, almost imperceptible click. At 7 a.m., he would return to the kitchen, where the coffee pot would be humming softly on the counter. He would take his seat at the table, the same unwashed mug on his left, and the kitchen light would dim to a warm amber. He would sip the coffee, his eyes fixed on the newspaper, which he always read in a quiet, almost reverent way. The newspaper would be the same local paper, the same front page, and he would flip through the pages at a measured pace, never looking up from the print. He would leave the mug on the table, and for the next hour there would be no conversation, no phone calls. The only sound would be the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional distant traffic noise. At 9:30 a.m., he would leave the house again, always leaving the door locked with a single click. His phone would be in his pocket, the screen off, the battery icon showing 85% at the time of departure. He would drive for about 25 minutes, the radio always set to the same station, the same playlist of soft rock. When he returned around 10 a.m., he would walk straight to the living room, sit on the sofa, and watch a single episode of the same show, the same channel, the same time slot. He would not adjust the volume, never touch the remote, and would not comment on the plot. The television would remain on, its glow a constant in the dim room. From 1 p.m. until 2:30 p.m., he would be in his home office, the same desk, the same chair, the same stack of files on the left. He would type on his laptop, his fingers moving in a steady rhythm, the screen always displaying the same spreadsheet. His phone would rest on the desk, its screen off, the notification light never flashing. He would not speak to anyone, not even to the mother, who would quietly bring him a glass of water and leave it on the desk. The silence would fill the space, the only interruption being the faint hum of the computer. At 6 p.m., he would walk back to the kitchen, the same route, the same steps, and would sit at the table again. He would eat dinner alone, the same plate of pasta, the same fork, and would not engage in conversation. He would finish his meal, wash the dishes, and return to the living room. The evening would continue with the same routine, watching the same show, the same channel, the same time, until the clock struck 10 p.m. He would then head to the bedroom, the door locked, and the room would fall silent, the only sound being his own breathing. On the night of March 14th, everything changed. He arrived home at 6:45 p.m., a full half hour later than usual, and he was wearing a dark jacket instead of his blue hoodie. The car was no longer parked at the far right corner. It was in the middle of the driveway. He walked into the kitchen, paused for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he spoke, his voice low. "I need to talk." The routine, which had been a steady, unchanging pattern for months, had finally shifted, and the silence that had defined his days was broken. He had stepped onto the porch at 6:45 p.m., the late afternoon light slanting across the porch boards. The car, a gray sedan, sat in the middle of the driveway instead of its usual spot at the far right. He pulled the dark jacket over his shoulders, the fabric damp from a sudden shower in the city. He paused in front of the kitchen, eyes fixed on the stove, and then, for the first time in months, said, "I need to talk." The words were short, but they carried a weight that had been absent from the kitchen's quiet routine. Inside, the kitchen was still. The refrigerator hummed, a faint blue glow from the LED strip behind the door. He walked to the counter, lifted a glass of water, and then placed it back on the table without a sip. The clock on the wall read 6:48. He stared at the blank wall, his fingers tapping the countertop rhythmically. The phone on the counter, a black iPhone, lay face down. He didn't touch it. At 7:02, the front door opened. His sister, Maria, stepped in, her hair in a loose knot. She paused, noticing his stillness. "You okay?" she asked, voice tentative. He didn't respond, just nodded. She moved to the living room, the soft thud of her shoes on the hardwood floor echoing. The television was off. The only light came from the lamp beside the sofa. At 7:15, the phone on the counter rang. The tone was a standard ring, a soft, repetitive chime. He didn't pick up. Instead, he turned to the window, the glass reflecting the twilight. The sound of the ring faded into the background. He turned again, his hand hovering over the phone, but he never touched it. The call went to voicemail, a recorded message in a synthetic voice. "Hello, you've reached Alex. Please leave a message." He listened to the voicemail twice, his lips tightening. The phone was then left on the counter, silent. At 7:30, Maria returned to the kitchen. She found him sitting on the edge of the counter, his back against the wall. The room smelled faintly of coffee, the mug on the counter empty. He didn't look at her. He simply stared at the floor, fingers curled around the glass of water. When Maria reached for the water, he gently placed his hand over hers, pushing her back. She recoiled, a small gasp escaping. He did not say a word. He stood, walked to the back door, and closed it, the click of the latch resonating in the quiet. At 8 o'clock, the kitchen lights flickered on automatically. The lights were a soft white, casting a warm glow over the room. The phone on the counter rang again, this time a different tone. Short, staccato. He didn't pick up. Instead, he moved to the living room, sat on the sofa, and watched the television. The screen was dark, the only sound the hum of the air conditioner. At 8:15, the phone rang once more. The ringtone was a simple melody. He turned his head toward it, his eyes darting back and forth. He did not answer. The call was recorded. He let the call go to voicemail again. The recorded voice said, "You've reached Alex. Leave a message." He stared at the phone, his face a mask of neutrality. The call ended. The phone fell silent. At 8:30, Maria entered the living room. She found him sitting on the sofa, head bowed. He was staring at the ceiling. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "What's going on?" she whispered. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was no answer. The silence stretched. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost audible. He did not speak. He simply turned his head toward the door, as if considering leaving. At 9 o'clock, the house was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. The phone on the counter was still on the counter, face down. He stood, walked to the front door, and opened it. The night air was cool. He stepped out, the porch light dimming behind him. The phone was left on the counter, its silence a stark contrast to the conversations that had unfolded around it. He walked into the night, his footsteps echoing on the porch boards. The only explanation he offered for his behavior was work. The word hung in the air, a simple phrase that did not answer the questions that lingered. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his boots, and paused for a moment to let the cool night air settle around him. The street was quiet, the only sound a distant hum from the streetlight that flickered a steady amber glow. It was then that a vehicle appeared on the curb, its presence cutting through the stillness. A black sedan, its paint matte and unadorned, rolled to a halt just a few feet from the front door. The driver's side window was slightly up, allowing a glimpse of a person inside. He was a man in his early 30s, wearing a dark navy suit that matched a crisp white shirt. His tie was a subtle gray, and his shoes were polished to a dark sheen. A badge clipped to his lapel glinted faintly in the streetlight, and a name tag read Officer Ramirez. He was flanked by a second officer, a woman in her late 20s, whose uniform was the same navy blue, but her jacket was adorned with a few more patches and a badge that read Deputy. Both were in plain clothes, the kind used for routine investigations, but their posture was formal, their eyes scanning the surroundings as if cataloging each detail. The door opened a crack, and a small group of investigators stepped onto the porch. They moved with a measured pace, each step deliberate. The air around them carried the faint scent of rain, even though the sky was clear. The investigators spoke in a calm, measured tone, their voices low enough to keep the conversation private, but clear enough to be understood. "Good evening," Officer Ramirez began, his accent neutral. "We're here regarding the incident that was reported earlier. May I speak with the homeowner?" The homeowner's eyes flicked to the door, then back to the investigators, and he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement. The investigators did not rush. They took a moment to observe, to ensure the house was secure, and then turned to the doorframe, where a small white envelope lay on the threshold. The envelope was addressed to the homeowner, the return address clearly marked with the precinct's name. The envelope was not a courtesy letter. It was a summons, a formal document that had been delivered earlier that afternoon, and it had been waiting there for the homeowner to read. The investigators exchanged a brief glance. Then Officer Ramirez lifted the envelope and read the header aloud. "This is a notice of a scheduled search, which we will conduct at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow," he said, his voice steady. "We are not here for a routine visit. You were notified in advance, and this is a procedural follow-up." He paused, allowing the words to settle. "Please let us know if you have any questions about the process." The homeowner, still standing in the doorway, listened. The investigator's clothing, the precise language, and the envelope's contents all aligned to create a clear, unambiguous message. No theatrics, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet efficiency of law enforcement in action. The investigators did not linger. Officer Ramirez tipped his hat, a small, respectful gesture, and the woman followed, their steps echoing across the porch. As they turned to leave, the homeowner watched them for a moment, the weight of the envelope in his hand heavy with the reality of the situation. He turned the door closed behind them, the click of the latch a small punctuation in the evening. Later that night, he would lay the envelope on his kitchen counter, its paper stiff and unyielding. The phone remained silent, its screen unlit, but the house now carried the unmistakable sign that the investigators had come, that this was not a casual visit, and that he had been informed beforehand. The investigators pressed their questions into the quiet kitchen with the same measured patience that had guided the rest of the night. "When did you last see her at the office?" one asked, pointing to the faint scar on the back of his left hand that had been hidden in the corner of the hallway. "What time does she leave for the train?" another inquired, noting the worn leather notebook that always lay beside the sink. They didn't ask about the obvious, her name, her age, her job, but the details that mattered to a family's rhythm. The exact moment the clock struck 10 on a Tuesday, the sound of the bus pulling into the stop on Maple Avenue, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway after she'd gone to the gym. The questions drifted from routine to specifics, each one a thread pulled from the fabric of their shared life. "Did you ever notice the extra set of keys in the drawer?" the lead investigator whispered. "Who does she bring home on Friday nights?" They asked about the late-night phone calls that had always been answered by a stranger's voice, the sudden trips to the grocery store that left the pantry oddly stocked with items that never appeared on the weekly list. When the family tried to answer, the answers were vague or outright blank. "We don't know," one said, the word hanging like a question mark. "It was just something she did." The investigators took note, their eyes flicking to the calendar on the wall, the dates of birthdays, the anniversary of their wedding, dates that had been marked with a red circle, a reminder of a life that seemed to shift with the tide. In the dim glow of the living room, the investigators recorded each detail, each hesitation. They asked about the quiet Sunday afternoons spent at the park, the way the family dog would lie beside the front door, the small, unassuming apartment on the third floor of the old brick building at 42 East. "Did you ever hear the sound of a door opening behind you?" one asked, pointing at the hallway that had always felt the same. The family's responses were a patchwork of memories, half forgotten and half fabricated, and the investigators saw the gaps widen with every question. The house, the envelope, the silent phone. All of them were pieces of a puzzle that had been assembled by someone else, someone who had already known the answers the family had been searching for. The investigators' questions were not just a list of facts. They were a map of the family's blind spots. They revealed the moments when the family had been unaware of a second life unfolding behind closed doors. The questions turned the light in the kitchen into a spotlight, illuminating the cracks in the family's perception of each other. The investigators spoke quietly, their words a gentle reminder that the truth was not something to be found in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small, unexamined details. If you've ever looked at someone you thought you knew and wondered if they were living a second life, share your story in the comments below. The investigators had already pieced together the facts that the family had been blind to, and the envelope on the counter was a silent testament to that revelation. The investigators lingered in the dim kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the faint metallic tang of the envelope that had slipped unnoticed onto the counter. Outside, the town's rhythm continued, children's laughter from the playground, the steady hum of the streetlights, and the low murmur of neighbors exchanging gossip. Inside, however, a quiet certainty settled among the investigators. They had mapped the invisible scaffolding that had kept the truth hidden for years, and they were beginning to see cracks. In a place like this, where everyone knew everyone, reputation was currency. Mr. Ramirez's years as a respected high school teacher and his volunteer work at the local church had earned him a place of trust that was rarely questioned. When he spoke, people listened. When he signed a name on a contract, it carried weight. The investigators noted how his job status amplified the authority bias that permeated the community. People assumed he was above suspicion because his career was built on nurturing others and upholding moral standards. The same bias extended to his family. His wife, Elena, was seen as a devoted mother, her quiet demeanor reinforcing the image of a wholesome household. Their children, already admired for their academic achievements, were shielded by the halo effect that surrounds well-regarded parents. Community silence was another pillar. In a small town, rumors travel faster than facts, yet the investigators had observed a pattern of selective listening. When whispers about unusual behavior began to surface, neighbors chose to ignore them, citing respect for privacy or the fear of tarnishing the family's name. The investigators recorded how a neighbor's casual remark about a mysterious call at night was met with a polite nod and a dismissal of just a phone call. The collective silence was not born of malice but of a shared belief that the Ramirez family was a pillar of stability. The investigators had seen how this silence allowed the family to operate in a bubble, insulated from scrutiny. The investigators also uncovered subtle mechanisms of assumption. When the Ramirez family attended church services, their presence was taken as a sign of spiritual commitment. When Elena posted photos of family dinners on social media, the community assumed she was simply sharing wholesome moments. No one questioned the authenticity of the smiles because the family had long been a template for what a normal life looked like in the town. Yet the investigators sensed the first tremors of failure in this protective shield. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the town's conversations had begun. A teenager in the high school's drama club whispered about a strange man seen lingering outside the Ramirez house. A neighbor's daughter, who had just started her own small business, mentioned how she'd heard odd noises in the night, but had dismissed it as the wind. The investigators noted the subtle change. The once unquestioned assumption that the Ramirez household was above suspicion was now being challenged by a handful of new voices. In the quiet of that kitchen, the investigators realized that the protective mechanisms, social trust, job status, reputation, were not infallible. They had been built on the community's collective faith in a family that had been a fixture of the town's identity. But faith, when unexamined, can be fragile. The investigators understood that the first signs of the shield's fragility were already present in hushed conversations, in the hesitation of a neighbor's voice, and in the slight widening of the envelope's edges. As they left the kitchen, the investigators felt the weight of what they carried, a truth that could no longer be contained by reputation alone. The investigators stepped out into the dim hallway, the faint hum of the refrigerator still echoing from the kitchen. They carried with them the weight of a truth that had been building quietly in the shadows of the family's life. The father's work was not the sensational crime that the tabloids had suggested, but a web of clandestine operations that spanned borders and required a level of secrecy that left no room for error. His days were split between legitimate business meetings and covert exchanges that took place in nondescript locations, old warehouses, empty parking garages, and even a back corner of a small, family-owned restaurant that served as a front. In these places, he handled the movement of sensitive technology, rare chemicals, and small, but highly valuable artifacts that were coveted by collectors and governments alike. Each transaction required meticulous planning, secure transport, coded communication, and an intricate network of trusted intermediaries who were sworn to silence. The risk was palpable. A single misstep could trigger a cascade of legal repercussions, loss of life, and the unraveling of the family's safety net. The secrecy surrounding his operations extended into every facet of the household. He kept a strict schedule, often arriving late at night with a briefcase that contained not only financial ledgers but also encrypted devices. The children, unaware of the true nature of their father's work, were instructed to keep the house quiet, to never mention the mysterious trips, and to stay away from the basement where the father would sometimes lock away what he called projects. The mother, though outwardly compliant, had begun to notice the subtle shifts, the way the father's eyes darted when she approached, the hurried way he would close the front door behind him, and the faint smell of chemicals that lingered in the air after he left. The investigators realized that the danger was not merely theoretical. The father's network was known to rival intelligence agencies, and his enemies were not limited to corporate competitors. They included international operatives who monitored every movement, A slip in protocol could have exposed the family to threats that ranged from intimidation to violent retaliation. The family's home, once a sanctuary, had become a target. The investigators understood that the stakes were far higher than a simple breach of privacy. They were dealing with a life on the brink of collapse, where the line between safety and peril was razor thin. In the quiet of the hallway, the investigators heard a faint click, a door locking in a distant room. They exchanged a look that said more than words could. The realization that the family's secret had already been compromised settled in their minds like a cold stone. The father's careful facade had cracked, and the truth was no longer contained within the walls of their home. The investigators knew that the next steps would require more than just uncovering facts. They would demand a strategy that could protect a family whose very existence had become a liability in a world where secrecy was both a shield and a weapon. The morning light filtered through the blinds, but the house felt colder than usual. He turned his head when the father walked in, as if the presence of a stranger could be avoided by simply shifting his gaze. The father's voice, once a steady rhythm that guided the day, now sounded distant, as if spoken from a room behind a wall. He no longer asked about the day's plans. Instead, he let the questions linger unanswered, leaving the family to fill the silence with their own thoughts. In the kitchen, the mother paused mid-stir, glancing at the door before turning back to the pot. She no longer shared the same recipes she used to, preferring instead to keep the ingredients in a separate drawer, as if the act of cooking could be a private ritual. The children, once eager to help, now offered only minimal assistance, each of them measuring their involvement by how much they could avoid eye contact. They moved around the table with deliberate, small steps, avoiding the space where the father usually sat. When the father tried to engage them in conversation, they answered in short, clipped sentences, their words measured to prevent any hint of intimacy. The family's daily routines were subtly altered. The father began locking the front door twice, checking the lock with a new level of scrutiny that had never been necessary before. He set the alarm system to a higher sensitivity, and when the children asked about the change, he answered with a flat, "It's safer." The mother started to keep a notebook, jotting down times and names of visitors, a habit that had been absent until now. She began to read the doorbell's chime from a distance, her eyes flicking to the window before she opened the door. She no longer let the father in without a quick check of the visitor's ID. Mistrust seeped into the simplest interactions. When the father asked a question about the day's schedule, the mother's response was a brief, "I'll let you know." He no longer shared his plans. He kept them to himself, as if the knowledge itself was a weapon. The children began to speak in whispers, their voices barely audible even within the same room. Their laughter, once bright and unrestrained, now carried a hint of caution, as if they were wary of what could be overheard. The physical distance grew. The father's presence in the living room was more of a silhouette than a figure. He would sit in the corner, hands folded, watching the family from a distance, as if he were a ghost haunting the same space. The mother avoided standing near him, keeping a safe distance between them. The children, too, kept to the periphery, their movements measured, their eyes always scanning for potential threats. The house, once a shared sanctuary, became a series of separate zones, each person confined to a small area that offered a sense of safety. When the father entered the bedroom, he no longer unlocked the door with a simple click. He checked the lock twice, then turned the key and paused, as if he were unsure whether he was entering a familiar room or a new one. He would leave the door slightly ajar, a gesture that seemed to signal that even the walls of his own room were not fully secure. The family's attempts to maintain normalcy were met with a chilling reminder that the father's presence was no longer a comfort. The father's behavior shifted from familiar to alien. He stopped making jokes, no longer shared a joke about a shared memory. He no longer laughed at the children's jokes, and when he did, it was a short, half-hearted chuckle that did not reach his eyes. The mother, who had always found solace in his presence, now felt a growing sense of isolation. She could not look at him without feeling the weight of an unseen barrier. The children, who had once seen him as a protector, now regarded him as a figure that needed to be observed rather than trusted. In the end, The house was a place of routine that had been rewoven with new threads of caution. Every door was locked twice, every conversation shortened, every eye averted. The family's shared history became a quiet echo that was no longer heard. The father, once the center of their world, became a stranger inside the same house. The silence that settled over the house after the incident was not a quiet that could be measured in hours or days. It was a pervasive, low hum that seeped into every corner, a reminder that the walls no longer held the same warmth. The children's laughter, once a constant soundtrack, had been replaced by the muted clack of keys as they locked each door twice before sleep. Conversations grew curt, each sentence weighed carefully before it was spoken, as if the words themselves might echo back and reveal hidden truths. The father, whose presence had once defined the rhythm of the household, now occupied a space that felt more like an observer than a participant. He spent mornings in the kitchen, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind drifted to the questions that had never been asked. The routine of cooking, cleaning, and checking locks became a ritual that offered a semblance of control in a reality that had become unmoored. Yet, with each repetition, the sense of normalcy wavered, replaced by a lingering uncertainty that clung to the edges of his thoughts. Outside the home, the community's perception of the family shifted subtly. The once cherished reputation of the father as a pillar of the neighborhood was now punctuated by whispers of doubt. Friends and neighbors, who had once offered help without hesitation, now approached with a cautious politeness, aware that appearances could be deceptive. The family's interactions with the broader community became measured, a delicate balance between maintaining dignity and protecting the private turmoil that unfolded behind closed doors. In the months that followed, the children began to develop coping strategies that were not taught in school. They learned to read body language, to notice the unspoken cues that might signal danger. Their once unquestioning trust in the adults around them had been replaced by a nuanced awareness that safety could be compromised even by those who seemed dependable. They started keeping journals, documenting their feelings in a private space that offered them a sense of agency. The house itself, though unchanged in structure, became a symbol of the fragility of trust. Every creak, every flicker of light seemed to carry a memory of the past, a reminder that safety is a fragile construct that can be shattered by unseen forces. The family's shared history, once a source of comfort, now resided in the quiet corners of their minds, a quiet echo that was no longer heard aloud. If you believe that a public reputation can conceal private danger within a family home, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories that expose the hidden layers of everyday life. This is a real warning, not just a story.